This guy's rolling.
We're on.
And my slate's in the car, so I'm just gonna do that way. All right.
All right. Well, it seems like so overwhelming at times to ever to imagine how, given the number of crises that we're facing, we could ever really figure this thing out when you've got, people who are holding on to their fundamentalism on one end and people clinging to their superpower status on the other.
Mm-hmm.
How the heck are we going to figure this thing out? It's
it's huge.
A great challenge for my generation and the generation that's going to come next. My God, it's just such a big unknown. Anyway, so we're here talking with James Quilligan, who is, I don't even have your credentials lined up, so I'll have to get those next time. But anyway, we've been here for a half a day already, since last night, just talking and talking. I've been trying my best to avoid the core of our conversation, really, but we can't help but broaching it again and again and again, and we both have such passion for it. You obviously are a trained economist and economic advisor to international leaders, and I'm simply here trying to get some questions answered for people, and also get into the the nitty-gritty at times around what the solutions might look like, and what the real complex of problems are that we need to sort of bring our awareness to and sort out. That being said, I'm gonna try to come in on this in an interesting way. Chili and I were riding yesterday in the car and talking about the project, and Chili, in his sort of everyday kind of guy way, said, "I'm just wondering if this is actually maybe the end of capitalism." And I think there's something about that rings true in the air, and if a guy like Chili is thinking about it, he's not an economist, he's not thinking about these things really, but he's picking up on a note of, or a hint of, maybe this is the end of an era of something. What are your thoughts around that?
I don't think it's the end of capitalism, but I think it's one of the biggest crises that capitalism has ever faced. And so I think the whole point is, how is capitalism going to retool itself and come out the other end with something that resembles capitalism? And there are a lot of people now slicing and dicing the answers to that, because it's really very clear that the old style of capitalism is gone, at least in the West, and now we're going to have to figure out what this means at a world level.
What is the old style of capitalism?
Well, when I think of the old style, I'm thinking of Western liberal laissez-faire capitalism. And that's the kind of capitalism that we've had for the last 3 centuries, essentially. And it has to do with trade and finance and monetary policy that followed predominantly classical thinking, which meant that there was more emphasis on supply of money, supply of goods and services, than on demand. Less emphasis on demand, more emphasis on supply. And it's gotten to a heightened level in recent years, meaning much more emphasis now on supply. So when I think of capitalism, those are the things I think of predominantly. But obviously it's a very deep and broad subject, so that's just a very initial cut at that answer.
Sure. Do you mean that there's actually more of an emphasis on demand? You said there's a heightened more.
No, heightened.
It is more still on supply.
On supply, yeah, much more so. We're all familiar now. They even call it supply side economics since Reagan. The idea here is that it's very simple. The philosophy is that the business increases their supply of goods, and the demand will automatically follow. People will, so the idea is really focus your attention on building up production, and people will buy those goods that are produced. But every so often, like now, a crisis is produced because there's an oversupply, an overaccumulation of capital and wages become stagnant, and people can't buy the goods anymore because their wages are low, then the corporations, businesses have to lay people off, and as they lay people off, then it tampers with incomes even more, so you have this vicious cycle where people get laid off and there's less income and less ability to buy goods, and that means the corporations suffer and they have to lay more people off, produce less, and we're in one of those cycles now. And it's proof, really, that supply-side economics is only a short-term solution. So the idea, that Keynes had was demand-side economics, essentially. Increase people's wages, and they'll buy those goods. Do things that will balance the supply-demand equation, and that will, solve the problem. So it's an embrace of capitalism, but with an emphasis on the demand side of things, and that's essentially what Keynes had introduced. And now that philosophy is being re-embraced by the Obama administration. The new emphasis is on more regulation than deregulation. The idea now is the government has a legitimate responsibility to intervene in the economy when times go bad, like Keynes said. So all that now is coming back, and I'm not at all in agreement with that philosophy, but that is what is happening. Having said that, it doesn't mean I'm a supply-sider either. I think that there's a third way. There's an alternative beyond supply-side or demand, which is Keynesian-side economics, and it's that third way that I'm extremely interested in.
Well, I want to go there, but I also want to sort of get in a little deeper around this whole Keynesian sort of cyclic demand response to the supply-side crisis that's inevitably going to come about in multi-decade cycles, right? Mm-hmm. Why do we live with such a, why? I mean, we know that this is going to happen again and again and again, don't we?
Well, inherent to capitalism is a series of cyclic phenomena, boom and bust cycles, and no one has been able to really figure out exactly why that happens. We do know that it has to do with the time-bound world. In other words, materiality has its own set of ways of dealing with time lags. So where you have bureaucracy and you have temporal conditions, you have signals that go into a system, and they take a long time for the signals to go through the system. And those create time lags, and those create boom and bust cycles, essentially. So a different way of approaching it would be to have an ontological presence in the system in which these time lags don't exist anymore. And that's one side of it, but the other side of it is that the boom and bust cycle is really deeply based in a kind of bifurcated analysis of human psychology, which is there's a conscious and unconscious, and that it takes time or it takes effort or a whole process by which the unconscious contents come to the surface. When you think about it, demand side economics has worked kind of like that there's unconscious contents of need that come to the surface periodically, express themselves as demand, and the supply side is kind of human consciousness. So, deciding how it's going to parcel out the demand and not wanting the demand to rise up too quickly and tends to repress it.
Do you mean like I want a Lexus, and I want a new house, and I want a new suit, and I want to be able to eat well and join a gym, and these are all the things I want to buy, and I have to kind of parcel out.
It's that one there.
Do you want
Sorry.
to answer it, or?
Yeah, I suppose. Sorry. Center for Global Negotiations.
Stop in
It's a.
Like I want to buy all these things, and I kind of figure out what I can afford. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, except that people don't figure out what they can afford. It's just how much they can borrow, and that's the whole point. We're continuing to borrow from some source that resembles our unconscious in a way. You know, and so the model that we've created is that we can continue to borrow from that source and not have to pay anything back. You know, all the borrowing, we just owe it to ourselves. So, well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean any. You know, it doesn't have a real rich meaning. But we've deluded ourselves to think that, you know, we can continue to do deficit spending and not have any day of reckoning, and that's not the case. I mean, all this stuff has to be balanced out.
How does that equate to our current predicament? I mean, here we are, it's end of January 2009. We have a new president who's been elected on some pretty high hopes of his being able to sort of create a new politics in Washington and perhaps address foreign policy in a different way than certainly Bush has. And he's been handed, you know, he's sort of walked into this big economic crisis. We've already seen a $700 billion stimulus package passed by Congress at the end of Bush's term, and now we're talking about another $800 to $900 billion being injected into the economy. What does that mean, and what are its implications?
Well, it's directly related to Keynesian kind of perspective, and my sense is that it's not nearly enough, and it's not well thought out. But beyond that, it means that, you know, we're trying to cure a problem of borrowing that has been created over a period of years, and the cure, we think, is more borrowing. So it doesn't make sense ultimately. What has to happen is, you know, the United States in particular is going to have to balance its budgets. So, you know, the more we're borrowing, the less able we're going to be to balance our budgets. So the immediate goal to get people spending again, instead of saving their money and worrying about deflation of their value of their assets, and which is the part of the crisis at the moment. Instead of that, you know, we really need to be figuring out how to create more jobs in the United States that are sustainable jobs, not make-work jobs like I'm afraid that this new stimulus package is going to push toward. And beyond that, the United States has to be able to take steps to take down its trade deficit to a reasonable level. And also, its currency is in disrepute at the moment. International sources are not thinking that United States currency has much value at this point. So there's going to be a currency crisis at some point as part of these exploding bubbles that are going off. So you're going to see bubbles go off in commercial real estate and adjustable rate mortgages and credit card debt, and the banking industry we're already seeing. But ultimately, the United States currency itself is a bubble, and it will burst also.
It doesn't sound very good. I mean, is there any... It sounds like there's a lot farther we need to slide down this. Yeah, this is early 2009 when we're speaking.
2009 is going to be the worst year yet, and yet I don't think things are going to turn around at the end of 2009. I think we're in for a long L-shaped crisis that is really, really serious. And the whole situation here is that this is not a cyclical crisis. This is not something that we can just bring out new Keynesian policies and get back from greater deregulation to more regulation. This is the kind of thing that is a structural crisis. And the Obama administration has not, so far, and it's just in the early days of their administration, but has not shown any sign that it understands that. And I'm afraid the situation is going to have to get worse. The other element of this is that we're trying to fight these crises, economic crises, at the national level, and we should be fighting them at the international level. So that's one of the main reasons why, if Keynes was around today, he wouldn't be a Keynesian. You know, he wouldn't be trying to cure this at the national level. He would be trying to work out international solutions, I think.
So let me just clarify this. This Keynesian philosophy is such that if we stimulate the economy by adding more jobs and therefore more income, people will have more that they can spend, and they're also less afraid, so they're more willing to let it go.
Yes.
And therefore I can meet greater productivity demands.
Yeah.
And therefore increase profits in corporations, and it's sort of reversal of the cycle that you defined earlier.
Exactly.
But you're saying that there's actually a much deeper structural issue at play here.
Yeah.
Now, you know, I've said many times I'm not an economist, and I'm not even actually a filmmaker, but what I'm trying to do is kind of get to the bottom of something that I think has real merit to understand, not only for Americans but for the whole world, but particularly here in America, because we do seem to be at the head of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think I've discovered is that, you know, and I've read all sorts of books from the conspiracy side of things to the libertarian side of things, and I've seen stuff on the internet, and I've watched interesting movies, and some of them are pretty convincing. A lot of them are a little bit paranoid. But the one thing that does seem to make a lot of sense rationally is that we have this debt-based financial system whereby the Federal Reserve is actually a conglomerate of private banks who own stake or equity in this institution, which has been given the franchise of creating our currency or our money supply.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a quasi-governmental organization. It's somehow accountable to the government or to the Congress, but it's given this sort of like blank check book to create money out of thin air, which I think is actually an imperative of a government. Like we need to be able to create our money, but the fact that it's debt based, meaning that when we create the money, there's actually never going to be enough money in circulation to pay off the existing debt, seems to put us into this sort of less than the zero-sum game that we can never get out of. And when I follow that through, it looks like, well, from there, of course it's going to drive corporations mad for profit quarter after quarter, and of course it's going to drive unsustainable growth, and of course, because if you stop that, the whole charade is up.
Right.
And that it may have made sense 300 years ago when there was a whole continent of resources that you could use to compensate the flaw in this structural design. But today we're one world, we're all connected. You know, we've pretty much, I think, probably pushed human and physical capital to limits. There's really not much more you can squeeze out of people or out of the planet without some devastating consequences. That to me is what I seem to have come to realize. You as an economist, what do you, I know I just said a lot, but I mean, am I on the right track? Is this my thinking sound in this regard?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that brings up a whole host of problems. You know, how do we reverse that? And you know, also, why did we let this happen? And also, why do we continue to be in denial about it? I think those are three very major questions. And
say those again?
how do we reverse it?
Yeah.
How did we get here?
Right.
Why did we allow this to happen? And also, I forget the third point I made.
It'll come back. It's okay. It was only for my own internal notes. It
Yeah.
wasn't for the films, per
Yeah.
se. So I'm really not here to dominate the conversation, but I do want to sort of I want to see if what I think I'm onto here kind of makes sense. Now, that would imply that there's actually a deep structural issue. But when I've spoken to some other economists, they've said to me, no, that's not an issue because we just keep creating money. But it doesn't make sense to me because it seems like, but you just keep creating more money out of more debt, and we're never ever going to be ever. I mean, we're always under this debt burden, and if you really add it all up, I've seen different estimates, but if you add up the national debt, which is estimated at 9 or 10 trillion, you add on top of that just consumer debt like credit cards, mortgages, private debt meaning corporate debt like the money that they've borrowed that they owe to banks, and then the promises that government have made to take care of the elderly and the retired through Social Security pensions and so forth. We're looking at like $50 to $80 trillion in debt.
That's right.
And some people estimate the entire asset base, meaning every blade of grass, every wristwatch, every fiber we wear in our clothing at a total value of about the same, which would mean even if somebody is totally debt-free and owns their house outright and doesn't use credit cards, collectively, we own nothing. After 230 years on this continent of laboring and producing and building this massive infrastructure and looking as if we're leading the world in terms of wealth generation and wealth capacity, we actually are bankrupt. Is that true?
We are technically bankrupt, yeah. And, you know, the whole linchpin here is the interest rate. This is what has driven us to this crisis. And our faith in interest rates and our faith in an economic growth rate, which is greater than the planet is able to regenerate its own resources. So we've been creating a bubble for quite some time, and that's really the essence of this. We've all bought into the idea of interest rates, and especially during the last 30 years, it's created a new push to create credit. So, you know, if you look at a graph of money supply from the 1600s until the early 1970s, it went on a rather low gradient of increase. And all of a sudden in the early 1970s, when the United States took the world off the gold standard, the amount of money supply jumped enormously. It's cascading into almost a spike. So in other words, what's that mean? It means that there's a lot of money sloshing around, and the money is relatively worth less than it had been previously. But the underlying thing is that the new era of floating exchange rates that we went into rather than fixed exchange rates before 1971 has meant that there's much more credit available. In fact, whereas in the past, you know, the idea was that if you went into debt, if you had to borrow, that was a social taboo. Today, if you're not in any kind of debt, and that means you don't have credit, that's a social taboo. So things have completely reversed around in order to for us to accommodate this new style that we've gone into with the deregulation of the international monetary system and the issuance of more credit, which has created the massive amounts of debt that we now have. So there is no way out of that hole until we completely readjust the figures. And the only way we're going to readjust the figures is through jobs, income, changing of the value of our currency, expanding the circle to recognize that that value is created by more than just supply and demand, and that we really have to widen the circle of analysis to begin to bring in other sources of value, because it's only then that we're going to recognize, you know, the nature of debt and the nature of interest rates in producing this crisis. There are interesting stories about, you know, the origins of interest rates in Western culture, in Western economics, and how we allowed interest rates to really take things over. And historically speaking, you know, there was a point at which interest rates were considered a potential form of usury, because, you know, it would be the idea that you would be charging people compound interest that accrued over a period of time, which you know, the early church fathers thought was immoral. And there are strong injunctions from both Jesus and Muhammad against issuing currency that would be, that resemble usury. But capitalism has managed to develop rationalizations around that. And today, what is largely unconscious is that we have no sort of moral and cultural understanding of the meaning of debt. We just assume that we owe it to ourselves and that it'll be rolled over to future generations, and that somehow technology will advance so that progress can be made, and the growth rate can sustain itself, and somehow we'll be able to manage to come up with a new level of value creation that will continue to roll over this debt. But meanwhile, the debt gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the ground zero of that philosophy is in the United States, which is why the crisis is taking place here.
But having all this available credit, isn't that good?
From one point of view, it's been very good. You know, the social welfare state has allowed us to do social spending since World War II in both the United States and Europe. But I think it's proving now to be a bubble. and that the idea that the credit is good if it's based on a non-sustainable source of debt-based currency, I think is rapidly, people are realizing very, very quickly that that's not good. So in other words, just to make it simple, if after World War II, if you wanted to buy a house and you took out a mortgage, it was the greatest thing in the world, because having a house is the key to the American dream, and you could raise a family, and you could get your job and the car, and eventually pay off the mortgage to the house. So yeah, it's fantastic. But the problem is that that whole philosophy is institutionalized across the board in society, and there comes a point at which that particular debt level is unsustainable. So there needs to be a new reckoning in which we balance our budgets. We actually don't spend beyond our means, and that day is coming again. Now, the issuance of credit is still going to be an important factor in all this, but not nearly to the level that we've allowed it to be. At least before 1971, credit was manageable because nations were able to balance their budgets because there was a fixed exchange rate. Today, without a fixed exchange rate, the amount of borrowing that is taking place has no apparent limits, and we've even eliminated the hard-nosed regulatory agencies that would watch it. There is actually no regulatory agency at the international level that is watching all the international speculation, the financial transactions that goes on a daily basis from an international perspective. It's crazy, but that's the case. So all kinds of things are taking place at that level.
Isn't this evolutionary in the sense that so many of these innovations in finance have been, where on the one hand, it facilitates, for example, the Industrial Revolution or international trade, shipping. And we're talking about going back, even 300-400 years. That was a big industry, and it's ultimately led to the quality of living that we enjoy, particularly here in the West.
Right.
And at the same time, seems to come with some negative consequence. So an example of that being this moving off of the fixed exchange rates, which I've done a little bit of research into this. Something about at Bretton Woods, they agreed to have these fixed exchange rates, which I guess meant that the dollar was always going to be equal to so many lira, and the lira was going to always be equal to so many Swiss francs, and so on and so forth, right? Is that what it meant?
Close, but not exactly. It just meant that anybody could redeem $35 worth of gold, an ounce of gold for $35. So any other country could invest in the United States gold supply at a fixed exchange rate, which meant that provided stability to all the other currencies. Now, the currencies themselves could fluctuate within their countries, but they were always fixed to the United States dollar at a certain rate. And that's basically what it meant.
So when we unloosed that, it was probably done in self-interest and more national interest.
Yeah.
I know that there was a bit of a backlash internationally when it happened, in terms of people saying, well, this is the wrong thing to do. But didn't it facilitate, again, sort of the exponential growth that we've experienced since the 70s, and that there is actually a positive and negative side to that?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had an unprecedented era of prosperity at least since the 1980s. And so it has been very good. But, again, what you're calling economic growth, I would call a bubble. And because we set the tone for this in the early 1970s when we started borrowing without any kind of regulation at all, because we left the fixed exchange rates. We had no injunctions that we had to balance our budgets. So if you don't have to balance your budget, you don't worry about more borrowing. And so this institutionalized deficit spending just rolled on and on and on. And so, the economic growth that many people see as positive has now proved to be a bubble. And, you don't see that when you're right in the middle of it, but when you're on the other side of it and it pops, then you realize that what you've just gone through it has not been as virtuous as you thought.
I think there's probably been people all along who have seen through this illusion.
Yeah.
But, once again, you know, they're sort of a center of gravity in the mainstream that is in denial, or just for some reason incapable of recognizing, you know, the reality of such a thing. I mean, it's common sense. I mean, we teach our children quite differently. We say, don't spend more than you can earn. I mean, it's like a basic human principle of especially don't go into debt greater than you have the capacity of paying it off. I mean, you go bankrupt, and in other cultures, you could have languished in prison for years for that. Here in America, of course, we can just, you know, start fresh, which is, you know, in some sense great, because guys like Ford and Mark Twain, you know, they were guys who, you know, they tried something, they went bankrupt, they tried again, they succeeded, and look what they did, you know, for humanity in a certain regard.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to disparage credit. I think it has been very valuable, and the examples you cite, you know, are good ones. And but the whole idea here is that there needs to be another means of value creation, and the idea of borrowing from taxpayers, for example. You know, for example, this TARP program or any of the kind of deficit spending measures that we're looking at now, you're expecting taxpayers, first of all, in the bailout of Wall Street, taxpayers are going to bail out Wall Street, and then the Wall Street CFOs and CEOs are taking enormous bonuses out of that. That's ridiculous.
I can't believe the audacity. It's unbelievable that that's happening.
And taxpayers are expected to fund this this new series of measures that for investment in infrastructure that would more tangibly benefit U.S. citizens. But on the other hand, is it going to create? So taxpayers also are citizens, and they're also workers, at least potentially. So as workers, are the jobs going to be created that will really offset the taxes that are going to go into the infrastructure that is attempting to create the new jobs? I don't think so. It's not a massive enough project. And besides that, we're not, as I said earlier, we're not getting at the real fundamental issue, is that it's not a cyclical crisis. We think that, that these counter-cyclical measures that we're taking here are going to solve the problem because they appear to have done that in the past. We've been able to stimulate the economy and get ourselves out of recessions through these kinds of measures in the past, but that's not going to happen this time. This is a much deeper crisis, and there are many indications now that you know, this particular attempt at a bailout is not going to succeed.
So let me just test this hypothesis here that you're suggesting is the philosophy by which even the current administration, with all its hope and promise, is purveying, and that is this Keynesian response: increased demand, invest in infrastructure, government stimulated creation of jobs, more spending, etc. But and we're clearly borrowing this money from ourselves, but really we're borrowing it from the future, right? We're betting on that we are going to be able to increase our value producing capacity to such an extent that we'll be able to compensate for the debt that we're going into now. And that, I mean, is that the philosophy here? Because obviously everybody knows, I mean, it's no secret to Summers and the rest of the Obama financial team that we're going deeper into debt, right? What's the justification? Isn't the justification what I just said? That,
well, we're borrowing from ourselves and borrowing from the future. That's the way we framed it. But the fact is, that's the ideal or the theoretical. But the reality has been that one of the things that we're in denial about is that we've been borrowing from the environment, and we've been borrowing from people in developing countries. We've been borrowing from the poor. And that's been what's been financing our prosperity.
how do we borrow from the poor?
Well, by by giving them foreign aid and then charging them more for the debt repayments and all the other obligations that they have to repay us by, so that the aid is just a stimulus that gets them to really recirculate much more cash back to us.
And then when they can't, by going in and sort of taking more control of the resources that we get to profit from.
Yeah, but the thing is that we'd mentioned Bretton Woods that went through two phases. One is from 1944 to 1971. That was Bretton Woods 1. Bretton Woods 2 we're still in, although it's ending. And from 1971 to present moment, where it's been a different character. The first Bretton Woods was characterized by fixed exchange rates. The second one is characterized by floating exchange rates. We've mentioned that. But what we haven't said is that as part of the Bretton Woods framework, in both Bretton Woods and Bretton Woods I and Bretton Woods II, is that the United States has had the world's hegemonic currency. So what that means is the world's virtual currency that all countries need to carry out their transactions, at least by having U.S. dollars in the bank to act as it were gold, so that it provides value to their own domestic currencies. And they use it to pay their debts, and they use it especially to buy their oil and other commodities, and to use in international trade. The problem here is that if you own the world's monopoly currency, then you have a tremendous advantage, because all of that money that's out there in dollars in different countries has to come back to the United States eventually to be repatriated in value. So that's the other way that the United States has guaranteed that all the money is going to come back to the U.S. So it's put the United States in the driver's seat, because we have the special advantage by which the United States has been able to engineer its prosperity for a long time by having the world's virtual currency. And so, the problem in the United States can't just be looked at as a matter of the cyclical problems with the economy now. It has to be looked at in terms of the larger picture of the historical circumstances around the fact that the monopoly of the United States currency in the world is going to end. And in fact, we're witnessing the ending phases of it. That's something that we really haven't reckoned with yet. And that's why I say that value has come from the poor people of the world, as well as the international resources, the environmental resources that have been kept down in value for quite some time. The rate of spending, or the valuation of commodities, is very low compared to what commodities are really worth. Oil and gold and silver and copper and wheat and all the other agricultural and mineral products that are out there have not reached their true value and importance to humanity. And we've kept them artificially low for trade reasons, but it's also helped to benefit the prosperity of a rich country like the United States, who has the world's privileged currency. So all of those factors have been things that we've been not acknowledging directly. And all of that stuff has to come into the mix now, because as part of any solution to the United States financial crisis now, we really have to include the bigger picture, which is not just international economic coordination, which is definitely a start, but it's also when and how will the United States give up its monopoly currency, and what will that mean to the United States economy? That's the issue we've been avoiding, and that's the issue that the Obama administration is nowhere near addressing.
Hold on. Everything okay, Julian?
Yes.
You keeping cognizant of the time on that tape?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There should be about 20 minutes left.
So are you saying that it's inevitable that the U.S. dollar will no longer be the reserve currency of the world?
Yeah, it's inevitable for a lot of reasons. When you consider what the Fed does, the Fed is a handful of guys who are setting the interest rate that has to be adhered to by the rest of the world, because all the other countries, once the Fed sets an interest rate, then every country reacts to it and has to adjust.
How does that work? What is the interest rate? Start with there.
Well, there's different takes on what the interest rate is, but in the postmodern economy, postmodern meaning Bretton Woods II, with the deregulated monetary system of floating exchange rates, the interest rate is based predominantly on the ability of U.S. productivity to generate economic growth. But if you look at the reserve asset base, the United States says that the United States dollar is a reserve, is a fiat currency without a reserve base. And in fact, the reserve base is faith in the United States government. And what is that? I mean, that's just psychology. That's just, as long as everybody has confidence in supposedly that's the valuation base of the United States currency. And that's a very hollow argument. It's a rationalization, because economic historians will always tell you that currencies have been based on one resource or another, or a combination of resources, natural resources. So in effect, when the United States went off the gold standard in 1971, we really went on an oil standard. And when we look at interest rates in terms of the productivity of the American worker, the number one resource in productivity is oil. It's in food products, it's in transportation, it's in all the mechanisms, the machinery that we need to make things happen. So even though we don't have the oil on our premises like we had the gold in Fort Knox, and but we do guarantee, the United States guarantees the supply and stability of oil across the world through our military might. And that's been the implicit promise and threat since the 1970s, that we would protect the Strait of Hormuz, and we protect our partners in OPEC, and particularly Saudi Arabia, and that there was a quid pro quo that those countries would continue to denominate their oil trading in dollars if the United States would guarantee military protection for them, and that's still going on. So that whole thing will unravel. It has to unravel, because you can't have a handful of people in Washington setting the interest rate for the rest of the world, because it's the biggest contradiction that I know of, and there's many crazy, ironic problems with the world right now, but to have just a few people setting the actual value for humanity's interests is pretty ridiculous. And that's an inevitability, yes, that this will change. The other aspect of that I think is important is that when we're looking into the future and we're recognizing that there's a need to move off of an oil-based currency, there's an inhibiting factor in creating green jobs and the development of alternative energies, when in fact the world's leading currency is tied to oil for its value. So we're not going to get to the point of creating these new jobs and green jobs and developing alternative currencies, alternative fuels very quickly until we address the problem that the U.S. currency is based on oil.
So let me just check in with you again now, right? Step by step here. So the United States moves off of fixed exchange rates, thereby no international currency is pegged to gold any longer. It's now based on the U.S. dollar.
You mean in the future?
No, Bretton Woods 2.
Oh, Bretton Woods 2.
Right? Or whatever happened in 1971.
Right.
That was Bretton Woods 2,
yeah.
Right? What day was that, by the way?
August 15th, 1971.
I was born 3 weeks later. So by virtue of that, the U.S. dollar then becomes sort of the reserve currency of all world currencies.
Exactly,
right?
That's what's happened.
And so it's really sort of America is in the position of advantage. Clearly, coming out of World War II, the European nations are sort of indebted to us on a psychological, national level. So they allow this sort of transference of dominance of the Western economy to the U.S. I mean, they probably don't have any choice in the matter, right?
Right.
And the U.S. is already loaning them all this money to rebuild to begin with, right? Post World War II. So we're holding all this debt on the rest of the world, essentially, right? The rest of the world that quote unquote matters.
Yeah.
And so we now take this position of supreme advantage. We move off the gold standard, therefore allowing this fluctuation of value of international currencies.
Yeah, and with the increase of credit, the exponential increase of credit.
And that comes along with the exponential increase of credit because it's no longer credit being issued is no longer limited by some physical store of gold in Fort Knox.
Yeah.
It's now based on something more virtual, more abstract, which is the faith and credit of the U.S. government.
Supposedly.
The supposed.
That's the overt explanation, but the behind the scenes, it's implicitly tied to oil.
And the ability of the U.S. military to enforce guidelines and commerce of oil in the denomination of U.S. dollars.
Yes, and in so doing, that allows the United States never to have to balance its budget because it can continue to do this institutionalized deficit spending ad infinitum without Congress ever worrying about spending too much. I mean, obviously there's a dialectic between Republicans and Democrats about the spending issue, but the fact is that both parties, when it comes down to spending for pork, these people in Congress will do it and have done it, and this deficit spending is not something that has been worrisome, and apparently it isn't even worrisome now that Obama is gearing up this new program of his.
Right, because they're all willing to spend the money. It's just how they are going to spend it. One side wants more tax cuts. The other side wants to invest in infrastructure.
Right.
That's another thing maybe we'll come back to. But to finish this thought, so this actually ties this financial crisis to the energy crisis in a way that's almost undeniable, unmediated in a sense. I mean, everybody kind of knows everything is tied to money some way. But what you're saying is that inadvertently, not unintentionally, but certainly probably not, it's not in public awareness, that the actual reserve of the U.S. currency is our ability to basically control the world's oil supply. Mm-hmm. That's what backs the U.S. dollar.
Virtually, yeah. I mean, that's the biggest factor in the valuation of the dollar. Yeah.
Okay, but that doesn't actually contend with the fact that we were able to keep continually going to debt before that anyway, because we've had deficit spending, I think, since Andrew Jackson was president, right? He was the last guy to actually eradicate the national debt. So, even though in the Clinton era, supposedly there were a few years where he balanced the budget, any time where the government is spending more money than it's actually collecting, we're borrowing it from the Federal Reserve, right? Mm-hmm. And then in turn, the Federal Reserve goes out to other banks in the world and actually sells that debt to other banks, which then hold it on the U.S., mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So when we say we owe this debt, who do we owe it to?
Well, when you say we, who do you mean by we?
We, the citizens of the United States.
Citizens of the United States.
Who do we owe this debt to?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we owe it to the banks ultimately.
But which ones? Our own?
No, the banks that are our creditors, essentially.
Which are who?
Well, we don't know exactly. If you trace, who the banks are that have shares in the Fed, you can begin to sort that out. And I don't have a list of those, but
is that public information, or is
that? There's public. People are aware of who those banks are. But it goes beyond that. Then you say it's the banks, but it's the shareholders in the banks, and then there's like the customers of the of the banks.
So it's us, actually.
So, well, to the extent that it's oriented more to Europe and other places, it's not us, and that's part of the dilemma America's in. We're not really the creditors anymore. So we don't owe it to ourselves. It's not that isn't the case. We have outsourced this a lot, and we have a lot of creditors now around the world.
I read an article on the way here yesterday that someone went and interviewed the head of the Chinese investment bank, and in it stated that the Chinese have $2 trillion in debt, and that the Japanese hold another $2 trillion in debt on the U.S. Does that conform to what you're understanding? Is that true?
When you say they have debt, you mean that they've lent us that?
They've lent us that
much. We have the debt with them.
Right.
They don't have the debt
They're
with
holding
us.
the debt on us.
That's true.
That's true. Well, I mean, my God, how does that continue to reinforce this perspective that this is really a global financial crisis? What does it mean for them? Why the heck are they holding on to this debt? I'm almost lost for words in how big this question should be.
Calling in the debt?
No, I just mean like, it seems so complicated. Can you simplify it for the people who might actually view this video? Well,
there's a lot of aspects to this. We've been talking about the leveraging of the international economy for a long time, and that the United States trade deficit and United States internal debt is unsustainable, and people have been saying that since the 90s. And you know, some of us have been aware of it since the 80s, that it's unsustainable, and that for the reasons that you just cited, you know, why doesn't it crumble and why don't the creditors get nervous? But then, you know, on the other hand, people have always argued that that the United States has been a good investment, and if without the moral authority of the United States, where would we be in spite of the, you know, the Bush years, and that the United States still leads the way in terms of its international vision, and so, and the United States, in spite of some of the weaknesses recently, is still the place you want to invest your money, because U.S. Treasuries are the safest place to put your money. So the money does come back here, but the other reason I cited is that these countries collect dollars. They have to do something with the dollars eventually to repatriate them in value. So they all have to come back here to get your cash out of the dollar. It has to come back to the United States, where it can be cashed out. So
For what?
well, for a value that would go back to the other country.
You mean like if they have $2 trillion of money we owe them, essentially that's $2 trillion of goods and services that we owe them.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about in terms of getting their value?
Well, that's the dilemma that the other countries have at this point, because if they're holding U.S. dollars, and those U.S. dollars are worth less when they invest them back in the United States now, you know, what's the point of them holding the dollars in the first place? And that's the issue that is on everybody's mind. And, you know, when is that going to unwind? And then, you know, it will unwind, essentially. The market will make it happen. You know, it will dissolve, and, you know, then we're going to come up with the need to create a whole new international monetary system. Now, recently, the G20 has been meeting. They met a couple months ago in Washington, D.C., and they're going to continue to meet. I think it's in March or April of this year, as their second meeting. And, you know, they're gung-ho. They're saying they want to create a new Bretton Woods system, new monetary system. But none of them so far has come up with anything close to the kind of solutions that are necessary to create a new monetary system. It's all sort of a patchwork of the past, a new improvements on Basel II agreements and new ways of regulating capitalism, and but nothing that is too radical in its solution to involve the real consensus of understanding around the world that the two main underpinning crises that are affecting United States currency as well as world currency right now are the environmental crisis, along with the energy crisis, number one, and international poverty crisis. And those are the things that need to be linked to a new international economic policy. We're far away from being able to conceive of that at the moment with the leadership that's in place now. But I have every reason to believe that the ensuing crisis is going to make it such that we're going to recognize after we hit bottom that those elements, the international poverty crisis and the stealing essentially the world's resources at a cheap price, have been the underlying means by which value has been created in the Western economies. And so in many ways, some of the pronouncements of Western liberalism have been illusory, because we've sort of thought that this marriage between capitalism and democracy has always been a virtuous circle that has benefited all of us, and that has been the reason why we could create these social welfare programs and actually have foreign aid to benefit the poor and all that. That's all a big bubble. That's complete nonsense. And history will show that that's the case. You know, the fact is that a new monetary system has to expand the idea of value to recognize that there's a whole aspect of environmental and cultural value that we haven't been honoring in the valuation of our currencies. And that's absolutely vital as we move forward. And at some point, the international populace is going to realize that. We're not anywhere close to it yet, but it's coming. So the people who are making the economic decisions now, the political leaders, had better, you know, be looking ahead to the next 20 or 30 years, because Otherwise, there's going to be a whole bunch of bubbles that will burst. And certainly the international currency crisis is one of them. And when that bursts, you know, everything's going to change big time.
We haven't seen that yet.
No, no, but we're going to. And with the devaluation of the United States dollar recently has stabilized in value. It's actually gone up against the euro, but there's going to be a point at which the U.S. dollar will tank in value, and then that will create a tremendous amount of instability in currencies across the world, and we're going to demand a new solution at that point. At this point, we're just kind of piddling around, putting band-aids on the problem.
Wow. How much tape?
Good instinct. I was just waiting for you to finish that one.
This is great.
Is it?
Yeah.
I have no sense of it.
That's fine. That's fine.
You've got about 5 minutes here. I have to stop it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's on the door.
No, that's a mailman.
Mail. Do you have another tape, Shirley? Because I
Yes.
don't.
Just give me a few.
It is, and when I actually go through this, if we do this again in the future, I think we'll be able to. Well, I'm going to go into the solutions now, but I think we'll even be able to bring up these points in even more poignant ways.
Yeah, the thing about this conversation is that there's a certain amount of abstraction that's necessary to set the context,
Yeah.
and then it has to get specific about, you know, so it's got to go back and forth between the two.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's
And,
great. I'm loving it personally. I mean, I don't know how well the audience will follow some of this, but people have to. I mean, it's you know, I'm not trying to dumb this down for people.
Right.
I'm just trying to have them understand quite simply what the core issues are, and then those who are more interested can dive more deeply into what you what you were saying.
You're back up.
We're back on?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So I'm going to turn this toward more personal for a moment. Meaning, you know, what people who are watching this are probably thinking about, right? And myself included, right? So here I am, you know, I'm a 37-year-old guy, I have a small family. I have, at times in my life, probably foolishly walked away from making $500,000 a year because I was interested in following something else and doing something I was actually really cared about rather than just making a large sum of money. And I don't mean that for the viewer to be disrespectful or of that sum of money or what it could have probably brought about, but I've had to learn my lessons in a sense, going into debt, paying off debt, working really hard, and I finally feel like I've gotten to a place of stability where like I've got my family's health insurance, I got life insurance, I'm saving money, you know, I've got 2 working cars, I mean just basic stuff, you know, and I'm making a decent enough living that I might be able to buy a house. I don't want to go into a lot of debt, so, you know, maybe I can actually not go into too much debt, get a house, you know, I have children now. I'm becoming responsible finally. A little late on the scene, I think. My parents would have you think, but nonetheless, here I am. And now, whammo, financial crisis. I'm just about when I can start actually doing things right, you know? And my God, it's, you know, it's jolting. As much as I want to see these positive frameworks come about, I'm just as jarred by the instability and the potential disaster of our future as I think anybody. You know, I'm scared, you know? What the heck is going to happen? What are we really looking at? How far down are we going to have to slide? You know, where's the bottom? You know, because you're talking about we're going to demand it at a certain point because we're going to sink so low. But I mean, you know, where is that low?
Yeah, well, you know, people are speculating how low Wall Street might go. And as we speak right now, it's still above 8,000, which is pretty decent compared to what it could have been, you know, at this point in the crisis. But Wall Street will go much lower than 8,000, I can tell you. We have not come anywhere near bottoming out because, you know, this is a psychological and spiritual crisis of civilization. We are moving from a system of nation states with sovereignty to a system in which we're going to have to pool our sovereignty at the international level, and we're fighting it all the way because we're scared of what that might mean, and we don't trust the other cultures, and there's a myriad of reasons why we'd never done this before, and
plus there's a whole contingent of conspiracy theorists out there who say that's part of the plan for
Yeah,
world domination,
exactly.
world government,
Exactly.
and one world order,
Right.
and one global dominant global currency,
Right.
chips implanted in you, and I mean,
Right. Well, that's a big element too, and especially in the United States, there's a reactionary interpretation of globalization and what might come after globalization. But that's the key question: what will come after globalization? Are we going to have an internationally coordinated economy and global governance? And are we ever going to get to that point or not? And my contention is that that's the way that we're going to be able to pull ourselves out of this economic crisis, is we recognize that we're all in this together. It's so interdependent that we've got to recognize that people, culture, and their resources, people's resources, are the source of value that has been there all along, that the private sector has attempted to enclose the resources, capture the resources, co-opt them, privatize them. The public sector has colluded in that and made it possible that that there's regulation for the private sector to be able to do that, ignoring the people who live with the resources and ignoring the resources themselves. So, I keep coming back to that because that's the key to regenerating value in the future. And until we really recognize that, it's not going to be possible for us to reconstruct the international economy in any meaningful way and to regenerate our lives in a kind of global context where we really are looking at human dignity and human rights and taking seriously the issues of poverty and the development issues that are so important. We're not going to get anywhere near that until we really address these bigger issues, which largely has to do with the Western interpretations of property rights and the creation of material wealth and the individual right to make as much as possible without any limitations, and it's the idea that source comes from the human being and the expression of human individuality and human freedom, and what does that mean exactly, and where is the subjectivity in all this? And these are key questions that have to be really thoroughly examined. We've got to look at our drives and motivations and our consciousness in all this, because until we get to that point, we're really not going to be able to solve these problems.
Well, what can the individual do? What can the person who gets up in the morning and goes to a job and pays their bills and may have even saved some money or may be in debt but has a family to support, are not in positions of power and influence, but are your run-of-the-mill American, whether it be in Iowa or California or New York City. What can we do as individuals? Anything? Take our money out of the stock market? Because I know a lot of people are like, oh, what should I do with what's remaining of my retirement?
Right.
That's one of the big questions.
Yeah.
But I mean, can you answer that in a way that gives people some sense of what they can do practically?
People are always asking me, where should I be investing right now? And I was like, that's the last question I want to ask, because I've lost money in the stock market. I've lost money in different, I don't know anybody who hasn't so far. I made some bets that I thought were going to pan out and they didn't. And so I'm not the perfect person to ask in terms of practical solutions about where they should put their money. But there is no question that what we need to be doing is to honor human beings across the board. The essence of exchange and the solution that we are seeking, I think, is to recognize what the meaning of money is in some sense, in a deeper sense. And that not only involves looking at the history of money, but looking at what the potential of money is in the future. And we've got it all wrong. Money is a mediation of human value between human beings that can either create a virtuous circle or a vicious circle, and we're in a vicious circle now. And that should tell us that we've been using money wrong, and our attitude toward money has been strange, and in terms of the way that money is issued to us and the way that the creation of material wealth has been structured, there are a lot of adjectives that pertain to the individual. I can think of, alienated and suppressed and repressed, and there's a lot of psychopathological problems that people are encountering because we're forced to live in a system that obeys these rules. And the longer we don't disengage from that system and reclaim our own individuality in this and reclaim our own birthrights, and the more we're subservient to that system, the less we're in touch with the aspects of ourselves that are really meaningful. So in a practical sense, what people can do is to re-experience value in a direct way, not only in community, not only with local resources and protection of local resources, but also in terms of recognizing the connections between all the traditional things that have been talked about in terms of what our value is as consumers. I'm not proud to be a consumer. Some people are, and some people find that as an extreme source of value. I'm proud to be a citizen, but what this means is consciously opening up all the different strands that we have as economic beings, workers, as savers, as investors, as persons with human need, as persons who have to have a certain amount of consumption and therefore express demand in the marketplace, who have human need, who have ontological and existential needs to express themselves, who need to see themselves as part of a world ethos. These are all parts of human consciousness that have been misinterpreted by the marketplace, and ideas have been fed back to us about who we are and what our identities are, and we put on those hats, we've incorporated those selves, and they're not our conscious selves. We're much more than workers, we're much more than spenders and savers and investors, and all of those categories pertain, but there's a consciousness behind all of those that has to do with our motivations and drives and values. And until we can get into that source and to know, what that is, we're going to be lost. There are people out there that say, America's lost its way, and I would agree with that. At some point, we knew where we were going and how we were going to get there, but what we thought we were going for, which was material prosperity, has ceased to give us internal springs of understanding and happiness, and we've reduced everything to the lowest common denominator, which is that we're pursuing pleasure, we're just going after happiness, and we're not really getting into the deeper sources of value that make life meaningful. So what can people do? They can recapture that in their lives and understand that there is such a thing as conscious spending. And of course, during a recession or depression, people are much more conscious of their spending. They're not spending frivolously. That's the whole point. That's why there's deflation of the currency, because people stop spending, in terms of what Keynes said as the paradox of thrift. We all want to save, and saving's a virtue, but in bad times, saving is actually bad, because that means we're hoarding money that should go into circulation that would make things better. And that is a truth. But at the same time, what is the reason why we save? What is the reason why we invest? And we're completely unconscious about all these things. So we've got to look at those things from a personal point of view, but we also have to recognize what the meaning of the resources that we have are, not just in terms of their necessity of reversing climate change, and we know that the planet is polluted and we've got to protect the resources and preserve them, and that's all at one level, and that's all very, very important. But my sense is that when we come face to face with our carrying capacity, locally, regionally, globally, that gives us a moral obligation and an empirical obligation to organize. And it's through that self-governance and self-organization that we can begin to demand that things change. So, you know, people have been saying for a long time that the community is the key to making this happen, because it's in community where we still have, at least in many communities, where there's still the potential of having a kind of group consciousness take place in which people make decisions affecting their lives and decisions about the resources in their communities, which are under threat by, you know, globalization and banks and corporate and public governmental interests that are co-opting our resources. We've got to the point in material civilization now where we expect the private and public sectors to do their damage without us really standing up and trying to change that kind of system by claiming our own identity. The government says that they represent us, but they don't necessarily represent the interests of common people. They more, you know, are in association with the interests of corporations. Now, it's an indictment of governments, and but the idea here is that it's people themselves in community with their resources who are going to be able to spearhead change in the future. And it's only that can capture the commons, that the people who recognize that the carrying capacity of the commons and their resources on the commons are being violated. They're the ones who are going to be able to self-organize and create a new kind of consciousness that is the only thing that can transform what we have now in terms of public and private interests.
Well, you know, I can't not agree with your vision, but I don't see a way of getting there. Do you?
Yeah. Self-organization and more recognition of the fact that, you know, again, in your community where there's where value is being outsourced, that's kind of it's a moral violation of the rights of your community. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be commercial franchises like a McDonald's in your community, but what I am saying is that wherever that takes place, that money is being bled out of the community. Money should be preserved in the community, for one thing. But, you know, it opens up the whole question of, like, what is money, and what, you know, what we need to do is, at the community level, understand that money is an expression of cultural and value and personal value. We're far away from understanding that, you know, and we've got to recapture that understanding. That means that money will eventually become transformed. So, in other words, instead of money being based on gold or oil, money in the future has to be based on resources that are valuable to people. That means sustainable resources. So if you can imagine a basket of resources that gives value to the new currency of the future, that's exactly what we need. We need a renewable currency that works for us, which is based in human consciousness, in the needs of people, and also in culture and in environmental interests.
So again, it makes a lot of sense, and I'd like you to describe more of what the macro solutions you see are. And this sounds a little bit familiar with Bernard Lietaer's Terra, right? With this basket of goods. So you know, so that I mean, because if you think about even like precious metals, they come with such a tragic history in so many cases, right? And
Yeah.
there's only so much of it. And what I think you're talking about is we can still acknowledge the value of some of those things. Iron, gold, whatever it is, but we're also talking about replenishable resources that are in this basket of commodities,
Right.
which back currencies. But do we even have to have, I mean, isn't that just appealing to our materialistic sense of having something backing it? I mean, can't we have a currency system that is backed by integrity of community? And I mean, maybe I'm actually sounding more idealistic than anything right now, but I mean, why do we have to have this basket of commodities? What's so important about that?
Well, you know, supposedly we have faith in the United States government as being the reserve base of the currency now, and that we know that that doesn't work. I mean, that's not where it's at. But the idea of a faith-based currency is very good, to a large degree, because at least potentially in the future, if it's not faith-based in the government, then faith-based in people and faith-based in resources. Because when you look at it, you know, money is a kind of cultural commitment that it's a collective leap of faith that we all make, that if everybody trusts that each other, you know, has the investment in this value, then we all say, okay, well then it has the empirical and mainstream component, and I can trust that because everybody else agrees to it. It's a consensus reality. You know, to a large extent, that's what you know, gives us the confidence that money is secure and has value. But why should we go into the basket of resources? Well, I mean, again, you know, what we've gotten away from through, if you can see it through the history of money, is that at every level of valuation of money, it's gotten more and more abstract and more in the head and less in the heart. And you know, when there was no money, when there was just barter, or when there was, before you even barter, when there was just people sharing resources with their families, that's one aspect of the means of exchange and trading of value. And oftentimes that was looked at as mediated by a mythic god of some sort, and also the honoring of the assets directly coming from the earth, because that's a source of value, and everybody directly understood that. So what's happened is, over a period of time, when we got into barter, it still expressed community, and we still expressed the Godhead, and we still expressed the recognition that the things that we were trading came from the earth. But as the exchange token became more and more abstract, as we went into creating symbolic money, like coins and coins at first, and pieces of metal that represented a certain value, we still recognized that at least the metal came from the earth, and that it had some sort of symbolic aspect. But instead of the Godhead, now we were imprinting the picture of the king on the coin, so that, you know, we still had some sense of that there was a higher power of sovereignty, but we were getting a little more abstract. Then with paper money, we went into this complete abstraction, and that's when the real aspect of a debt-based currency began to come in with fractional reserve banking. Again, I'm tracing this to show that after dollars or paper money, with electronic currency now, it's becoming much more in the head and calculated exchanges, rather than in any kind of thing that expresses community from the heart, that expresses our sense of the idea that the exchange of value is presided over by some sort of spiritual guide or world soul or kind of ultimate purpose for us, teleologically and ontologically. And also the idea that the resources that we're actually trading come from the planet, and they need to be preserved and honored. So through this abstraction of exchange over a period of time, we've lost our sense of the spiritual root in consciousness and higher consciousness, as well as in the earth. And those are the very things that need to be brought back into a new economic system, not in the old sense of the traditional sense or the archaic, magical, mythical, modern sense, but in a whole new development in which we totally understand that all of these elements go into the meaning of money. Now, so why a basket of sustainable resources or non-sustainable resources? To get us plugged more directly into the meaning of resources as a sense of value for communities, but also the very fact that it's through community organization and our sense of coming together over the governance and creating the rules and regulations for the development of resources, and rather than outsourcing it to private interests or outsourcing it to the government, when we have direct control over our own resources. And that's not just environmental. The commons means intellectual resources, like the internet and intellectual property. It also means cultural resources, the arts and music, it means our spiritual resources and our genetic resources. all of those are part of our commons, and all of those have to be in some way reflected in human value, in a human currency. And those are the kinds of things that are possible. Now, it's not just in transforming the currency that this is possible. It's also possible in creating a new value stream right at the source of where those, where the value of the commons is regenerated. For example, people are talking now about a pollution tax, global pollution tax. Why not have such a thing that, you know, to create a revenue stream at the international level that the heaviest polluters are taxed, and that money goes back into trying to mitigate climate change, so that we have an adequate source of funding to address the problems of climate change and pollution and environmental degradation that is derived from a source that is actually, you know, creating the pollution. So we recognize that we can't just eliminate consumption and production. There's going to be some source of pollution, but there should be the adequate valuation put on it that would go back into mediating the problem and trying to balance it. The same with international trade. An international trade tax could actually go into back to the WTO as a means by which they can reinvest in communities to have worker protections and other kinds of protections for labor. There are many things possible in this. And there are many sources of value that can be looked at. The organization that's called Transparency International has something they call the Extractive Industries Transparency Index, in which they're advocating, in particular, that oil companies and any corporations that are taking minerals from the ground should have a fee imposed on them right at the source of their taking money out of the ground to benefit people in the local communities who actually the oil and the minerals are their resources, but they're not benefiting from them. So why aren't they benefiting from them? Well, to alleviate that problem, where, you know, in a lot of these extractive industries areas, there is massive poverty. Money should go back and should go not mediated through the private sector or through the government sector, but should go directly to fight the problems at those levels. There are many sources of commons trusts that are possible in the future. So in addition to a kind of commons currency, commons trusts can also be sources of the generation of new value at the international level.
So let me see if I can set a context for you to really speak into your vision of some potential solutions. You said earlier that this is not a cyclical crisis that we're in this time. We have evidence that to combat these kinds of cyclical crises, a Keynesian response has worked, and it's kind of fooling us at this point to think that we can do that again, because what we're not doing is addressing the real issue. And I think we've articulated the real issue on a number of levels. It has to do with it being deeply structural. And given that this is not a cyclical crisis that we're in right now, that we're not addressing the real issues, what do you propose the real issues are, and what do you propose the alternatives that can solve those are? Big question.
Well, the real issue here is that, you know, fundamentally, in my view, is that this is a global crisis, and we're not treating it like a global crisis. So the implications are that we need to take the steps by which we can cooperate as a human family, which means that nations are going to need to give up a portion of their sovereignty to enter into international treaties that make things possible to create solutions.
Like?
That's number one.
Okay.
Oh, like...
you can get into those if you want. I mean, you can present this case however you...
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that need to be addressed at the international level. It's you know, you could go on and on. I mean, we need... you know, as I said, we need a new international monetary system. We need a new framework for trade. We need a new framework for finance because it's unregulated, and it's also a potential source of Tobin tax that could be used as another commons trust revenue stream. We definitely need to look at the environmental crisis, the energy crisis, the poverty crisis. I mean, all of those are only going to be addressed at the international level by a coordinated effort.
But have you thought through what that would look like?
Yeah, actually. There's something that I've been working on for a long time called the Global Marshall Plan, which has a lot of striking recommendations about how that could work. But until we get to that point, we're going to have to give up our notions that foreign aid actually works, and that you know, that the G8 actually calls the shots, and they really can make a difference. And you know, we're going to have to, and the G20 really has all that much potential to make a difference. We're going to have to give up our notions of that the international institutions that were created, that I call multilateralism 1.0, has to be upgraded to multilateralism 2.0, and we're not anywhere near doing that yet. But you know, after World War II, United Nations was created, WTO, IMF, World Bank were created, and these were really brilliant solutions to address the problems that we had gone through in the Depression and World War II, to create a new way forward. But the framers of those institutions said, these are experimental, don't take these as crystallized in stone, and don't be afraid to expand them. And what happened was we've crystallized them, we've set them in stone, and we've used them as means by which we can continue to exploit the international system. And you know, whereas the World Bank and IMF started out as fairly benevolent institutions, they were turned into tyrannical institutions with their structural adjustment programs and whatnot. So, you know, colonialism hasn't ceased, and imperialism hasn't ceased. It's gone through different iterations. So solutions are going to have to look completely different, and there's going to have to be a much greater amount of goodwill at the international level to make that happen. But that's at the international level. The thing that people in their communities can do is anticipate that. So unfortunately, what happens is there's a reversion in the communities to say that just like the dualism that's everywhere in the world is out there, we're fighting against the dualism of globalization, darn it, and we're going to do it in the local community, setting up its own dualism in the local community because you're just pitting the local versus the global. So the people in the local community are absolutely convinced that globalization is the enemy. It's not the enemy. That's not the problem. You know, the problem is dualism itself, which people fall back into that trap. So, so localization is still important, but with the realization that you're a world citizen at the local level. And that's the realization that really has to sink in. So these are global solutions, but not because there's some hierarchy out there of privileged people at the global level that are making all these things happen. The fact is that without the global solutions happening in parallel with the local solutions and regional solutions, none of this is going to take place. So the carrying capacity of the commons that I'm referring to is both at the local and regional and global levels, that we need to address the idea that can our local resources support our population? And if not, then we do have an obligation to stand up in protest as a third force, as a third way against the prevailing winds that are coming at us and the assault that is coming at us from the public sector, meaning government, and the private sector. And that's really the way we're going to have to recapture value at the international level and regional and local levels.
So you're saying that the response to this for people is to become more aware of resources as both human and earthbound as the real source of value.
Yeah.
And that by standing for them, protecting them, preserving them, sustaining them,
right,
organizing communities around the principle of them as being the source of value,
yeah,
is the right response. And to do so in parallel with an understanding that we are going to need some sort of global global trusts that are monitoring and adjusting. I don't know if we would call it taxes or fees on the usage of such resources, and that we can also follow suit in the local level, so that when we assess what the actual carrying capacity of a certain pool of resources is on a population, or I should say on a population on the pool of resources, we can begin to think about money in ways that allows us to build in consequence for any unsustainable use of resources or any damage that will occur to the environment by virtue of some production that we have to do. So this is sort of a transitional process. It's not a anti-establishment philosophy. It's not an unrealistic, let's just do away with all the means of production. It's actually, I mean, systemically, it's brilliant, and I can see its application in multiple scenarios where whenever you're doing something at expense of either the people or the environment, that you're immediately incurring cost that is carried through the value cycle, so that the end user and all of the intermediaries are paying for a piece of that. But the purpose being that money is going into the solution simultaneously. So realistically, you can actually address these issues. Right? And you're saying, I mean, I know you've thought this out more deeply than I am here, but that there's a way of actually monetizing this. There's a way of actually assessing what those costs should be, understanding what the true value of those resources are, and having a monetary and financial system that equates to this philosophy.
Yes, with one caveat, which is that your analysis was right, and just until the last section that you talked about. The trickiest thing of all is to monetize this, because as soon as you go into an ecosystem, for example, and you start totaling up, what all the assets might be worth if they were available in the free market, just as an exercise to see what it might be worth, you've immediately created a feasibility study for somebody in the private sector to come in and say, let me just go out and see if I can buy that ecosystem, because it does produce some value, and it's a good investment for me. This is exactly the wrong area where we need to go, and where the trap has come in all theorists who have looked at this problem is to jump to the conclusion that we need to begin to monetize things. We need to recognize, in order to recognize the sense of human and cultural and social environmental value, we've got to think in non-monetary terms. And then as soon as we want to generate value, we start thinking in monetary terms. So in other words, how do you do that? How do you create a different kind of index that indicates value that doesn't allow itself to become monetized? That's the key thing. And that's where alternative currencies come in, but that's also where barter comes in and non-monetary exchange comes in. But at the same time, there are other unique ways of making this happen in terms of commons trusts, where you don't actually express your value through the private sector or the governmental sector and have it wash through that. You actually take care of it all within the commons sector, so that nothing ever gets monetized. You may talk about it in abstract terms with reference to the monetary system, but there are other ways of developing indices that are that directly correlate to the resource replenishment rate, which we need to move toward. So in the long run, if we, it's not, I don't think it's the case that we need to be thinking so much about discounting the future, because unfortunately, it is true that our ancestors provided a base on which we could accrue all of the investments that they've made, and now we're enjoying that prosperity. And it's also the case that we are, as a result of that, and as a result of our emphasis on debt and credit, that we have dug a big hole for our own future progeny in the future, and that it's such a big hole that they're going to be paying off our debt for a long time to come. So I'm not one who actually believes that if we look at the long-term trends here, that we should actually peg our aspirations in doing all this on the right of generations, 7 generations hence, to actually accrue the benefits of all this. I don't believe that's how we should approach this. I think that if we do that, then it's too easy to fall back into the idea that interest rates will generate that kind of level of economic growth that we need to carry us into the future. Norman O. Brown has, back in the 1950s, wrote this incredible piece about the spiritual implication of interest rates, or at least the psychological implications of interest rates, in which he said that we've elevated interest rates to a quasi-spiritual importance in society because they actually express our immortality in ways that we don't ever any longer understand them, our spiritual aspirations, in a kind of secular world.
Wait, say that all over again from the beginning.
Yeah, Norman O. Brown has written this incredible analysis in which he's looked at interest rates in a kind of psychological and quasi-spiritual way. And he's basically saying that the human aspirations are wrapped up in interest rates in a kind of way in which we see our immortality in interest rates. Actually, our investment will live on after we die. So we're immortal, but the interest rate, actually, whatever we put into our investment will live on, and it will grow at a rate faster than we appear to be growing. So we've given it this primacy to the extent that we've wrapped up a kind of conscious value in.
And if I could just get a level check on your...
Yeah, sure. So we're going to talk about, we're going to finish talking about the interest rate phenomena.
Okay, I'm not getting...
Oh,
is that on?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Oh.
Good? Yes?
Hello?
Okay.
Good audio?
Tap that lav. I'm not getting it.
Uh-huh. How about that? Now?
That's odd. Nothing's changed.
That sucks.
Yeah, that's...
Well,
would you tap your mic for a second?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's definitely what I'm getting. Nothing's changed here. What's...
Can you switch?
Try the...
Yep. Here we are. 5:15. 4:40. Man.
No, it's dead.
It's dead.
Yeah.
Alright, fine. Let's do this anyway. Are we on?
Yes,
speed.
you're speeding.
Okay. So let's finish that thought again. But let's keep it so that anybody who's not familiar with the metaphysics could get it. Best you can.
Well, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's about what you were talking about. You were saying that everything you talked about with Dave about the commons, that was like part of it, but unless we can understand how this, in the timeless domain, this interest rate is just bullshit.
Yeah.
And this interest rate is sort of like a fallacy around what drives value.
Yeah.
God, I don't know what you were saying before.
Well,
so important,
not to get terribly metaphysical with this, but there's a state of timelessness when we go inside, in pure consciousness. When we go outside, it's a time-bound world. And we're always mediating between the two things, but the time-bound world has been winning out, very, very simply put, over the past few centuries. And one of the components of the time-bound world is interest rates. Interest rates are something that that starts at a certain point, and then it ends at another set point in the future, and interest compounds as a result. And it's something that we love when we invest money in the bank, or we have any other kind of investment that accrues interest over time, because our money expands. And we like that because that means we have more money. It's fantastic. But we never really stop to think about what that means on a cumulative level for everybody in the world, meaning that we're all invested in this interest rate, which represents a certain rate of growth that has a time-bound component. When we do go inside, in terms of pure consciousness, no such thing exists. So it's only a part and parcel of the material world, materiality. So the interesting thing about this is that the interest rate has taken over, human civilization. It's certainly taken over the economy, but it's taken over the aspirations and goals of people to the point where William Greider and other writers like Norman O. Brown have talked about people finding a certain kind of immortality in the interest rate, that it compounds in a way that it's seemingly more immortal,
right,
whereas we're mortal. And so the thing about the interest rate that's interesting is that the banks really, that's their strong central motivating factor is keeping these interest rates going, because that's how they make a living, and they're dispensers of the interest rates essentially, because they tell people at what level they can borrow and what level they can invest. So it's an interesting phenomenon, but it's the interest rate. If you could pin one central factor for the crisis of capitalism, it's the interest rate itself, which people would say, well, wait a minute, it's the single greatest factor of capitalism because it contributes to economic growth. No question about it. But the problem is that rate of economic growth is at a level or a rate of activity, let's say 3 to 5% or 7% or whatever that growth is, that we've become used to, that is much higher than the rate at which resources themselves can be replenished and regenerate. So there's a dichotomy there. There's a problem in that we've got the economy moving at a pace that goes much faster than the pace at which resources can self-regenerate. And this is the essence of the economic crisis that we're looking at right now. And yet it offers the key to a lot of solutions on the horizon, because you've got the bankers over here talking about how resources give value to money and give value to society. And you've got the environmentalists over here talking about how resources give value to society. And yet the two are not talking about the same thing. They're not bringing their stories together. And that's what has to happen. They have to be in sync and have the same kind of vision about what's possible.
Right.
And that is possible. It is possible. And in fact, I think future generations are going to insist on this. And I think you see all the strands now where it's all coming together, but we have to weave it now.
I think I'm getting what you're saying. The interest rate is an expression of our fear of death, in a certain regard. It's the legacy that we get to carry on after we're gone, because our money can still be accruing value even though we're not here to enjoy it necessarily. But more than that, the interest rate drives growth. But what we're experiencing now is an out-of-control growth addiction, pressure that is just over-consuming the planet's resources in such a way that it's suicide. It's an unsustainable scenario. And I think the argument that might arise would be, well, if there wasn't this pressure, could we still have growth? Could we still enjoy the benefit of what growth has seemed to have brought us? And I guess I put that question back on you. Would human beings still innovate? Would they still try to create value if there wasn't an incentive? Because that's really what the interest rate kind of in a certain way does, right?
Yeah, it's had that effect, but there's no question that we have the incentive planted in us because we want to make more money. But obviously there are other incentives. There are other ways that we can express value and derive pleasure and happiness and conviviality and honor each other's dignity that don't necessarily have to follow the interest rate. And we know lots of those. Civil society organizations and just human beings everywhere understand those premises. Okay. But the argument that if you didn't have interest rates, then you would reduce incentives comes out of a kind of fundamentalist capitalist vision And I don't agree with that, because I do think that the incentives of human beings haven't really been explored in the depth that they could be. And it's an assumption that we're making that, you know, without the incentives built into interest rates, that we would, you know, suffer greatly. I don't think that's the case. I think that the capacity of human spirit to continue to aspire upwardly doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be in some kind of time-bound mortal sensibility by which interest compounds over time and I get the payoff at a certain point. Because this is the key point, I think. The interest rate takes us out of time, because, you know, when you've got a debt payment to make, or when you've got an investment that is accruing at the moment, you think back to the time when you started the investment or took out the loan, and you also look forward to the time when you get the payoff, or that you're all paid off in what you're in paying off your loan. So it's a constant source of anxiety in your life about, you know, thinking about the payoff. We're waiting for that retirement, or we're waiting for the point when the mortgage is paid off, or whatever it is. That brings us out of our timelessness. These are things that continue to bring human consciousness out of an expression of inward values, because we're so focused on outward values. So it's a way that human beings have had of kind of deluding themselves and not looking inwardly into that other timeless space. And in that timeless space, we're going to find that the regeneration of resources, intellectual, cultural, genetic, environmental, social resources, that we know as the commons, is a really tremendous source of value that we've hardly even tapped. And we don't know how to express it as a source of value, except in terms of what we mean by values as a kind of non-concrete expression, you know. But there are concrete expressions of value that we can tap and that can be concretized and that we can take advantage of. There's lots of them, lots of examples of them. And that's what's going to happen in the future. And we're going to discover that. But we can't do that so much as individuals, but we have to do it more as groups. And groups of people coming together to form exploration committees through dialogue, through means of organizing, and through that self-governance of different groups. A new kind of consciousness is formed that protects and preserves the resources, guarantees their regeneration, and yet a greater synergy is created, because in the condition of protecting the resources, we create a new kind of consciousness. And it's that consciousness, and I would say no other kind of social consciousness, that is going to be able to transform the market state, or meaning the private sector and the governmental sector as it exists today.
Okay, final point. Because earlier when we got cut off, you were talking about investing in the present. And I think what you're also saying is that, what I'm getting is that the interest rate is part of the artificiality. You know, what I mean is, I think in pure economy, you have, you know, the realm of economics should be, you know, accurately reflect, you know, the money sphere should accurately reflect the, you know, what exists, what value, that tangible value there is. Yeah. The more abstract you make economy and financial engineering, the more you can manipulate it. And we're totally out of whack today. We have like this abstract thing, these numbers on the clock, that if they somehow dip, we stop picking fruit off a tree because there's no money to pay somebody, but the tree hasn't stopped actually producing fruit, and the sun hasn't stopped shining, and the rain hasn't stopped falling. But we stop laboring and contributing to the synergistic co-creative process of production because some numbers on a stock exchange dropped. And it's such an abstraction of reality that, and it's so off kilter. As a matter of fact, it's taken on a life of its own. It's like we can't even control it any longer. We're arrogant. We were arrogant enough to think we could create something as if we were gods. And this thing is now sort of taken. It's like the Borg, you know. It's like this classic, you know, Orwellian state, but we've done it to ourselves. It's this thing that now controls life. It's like life serves money instead of money serving life, right? And the interest rate is it's this artificial factor in that machine that's sort of driving through human reality right now. And at the same time, it takes us out of the present. Because either we're at the effective debt and we're anxious for the moment when we complete it, or we're accruing benefit from our investments and we're still out of the present because we're waiting for the payoff in the future. So in either case, we're not present.
That's
and
right.
when economists and pundits are on the TV are talking about either indebting our future or investing for the future, what you're saying is that's the wrong perspective.
Well, that's the perspective we've had in the past. And in the past, what it's meant is greater degrees of poverty and greater degrees of environmental degradation. We haven't valued the honor of people and their dignity. Half population is in poverty at the moment, global population. And certainly the environmental crisis is showing us that the system that we've developed over the last 2 or 3 centuries has really gone off the rails. We've really ignored the fact that paying attention to long-term growth is important because we keep rolling over our debts into the future. We borrow from nature. We borrow from the labor of poor people in keeping commodities cheap and providing a source of us being able to continue to do our deficit spending and never having to balance our budgets. The presence that I'm referring to is the idea that when we become aware that value is created locally and that we create value, not that it's created through interest rate, it's a whole revolution in thought and activity, because then it's very empowering. And it's impossible to do it unless we're present. And we're present to each other in the self-governance of the resources and being present to the resources as well. So it's bringing the ontology that's always been the missing piece in Western philosophy, and economists have always been trying to figure out where this would come from. You know,
the invisible hand.
Kant said it was art, or in the aesthetic dimension, and others have tried to look at it for it in Romanticism and other sources to generate some kind of immediacy in the institutions that are out there. And in fact, those are all the wrong sources. I mean, because they're regressive and they all have their problems. The thing is, it's a pure ontological presence to people and to resources, and that only that can carry itself into the laws and institutions that we have, which are themselves caught up in the time lag, you know, in the bureaucracy and in the indirect feedback loops and the business cycles and the interest rates that are the algorithms that are driving the exterior economy. And it's recapturing that inner economy and really finding our sources in it that is really going to pave the way to a new expression of human civilization. And the way is pretty clear to some people moving forward, that it has to do with group consciousness, self-management of resources, including all the, not just the environmental ones, but the ones of the noosphere, meaning the ones that are mental and cultural and social. Those are all vital as well. So it's all those resources that are going to be able to provide us value in the future. And this is not just an abstraction. This is, there are tangible ways of doing this. And you know, in another discussion, maybe we can really focus on the concrete ways that can take place.
Good. I look forward to that.
Yeah, me too.
All right. That's a wrap. Cut, and that's a wrap.
Super. All right.
Gosh. Could just go on and on. I don't want to end. I'll get that off of you. Oh, you got it.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to turn it off.
That's fine. Just put it on the table.
Hey, Jovi, we're going to go in the car. We're going to take Tim to 30th Street Station. Yeah.